As the story of Buddhism has unfolded over the course of these lectures, we've seen that Buddhism is an extraordinarily malleable and adaptable tradition. I think we can agree on that. The Buddhist tradition has changed so much that we would have to say one of its primary characteristics is its flexibility, its downright changeableness. It's made it pretty elusive for us, pretty challenging, but also pretty elusive and difficult for us to pin down exactly what it is that's Buddhist about each one of the movements that we've seen. From India, its homeland, it spread into just about every corner of Asia. And it transformed the civilizations it encountered, while it too was being transformed in ways that would, I think, have been unimaginable to its earliest practitioners. It should come as no surprise to us to see that in the last chapter, or at least the last that we're able to witness, Buddhism today has become an influential part of the culture throughout Europe and the Americas. In this final lecture, we're going to consider some of the ways Buddhism has entered Western culture. And we also will consider some of the ways this encounter has changed the Buddhist tradition itself. The first serious scholarly contacts between Europeans and the Buddhists of South and Southeast Asia took place during the 19th century, as European colonial officials attempted to study, as you can imagine, the culture of this inchoate colonial population that they were attempting to gather some knowledge of. An early precursor of this movement, who is a hero for me and is a hero for many scholars who work in this field, was a brilliant British colonial officer by the name of William Jones, Sir William Jones, who was known as Oriental Jones to his contemporaries. Jones helped institutionalize the study of Sanskrit. And what that means, really, this may sound funny to you as a way to start out the discussion of all of this, but this was a big deal. This is the guy who first was able, as a European, to come to some understanding of the classical languages of India and begin to make those languages known. This is important especially for the study of Buddhism, because Buddhism itself had died in India. It wasn't accessible simply through the contemporary culture. Jones made it possible for people to study the Sanskrit language, to write scholarly articles about it, and to begin to dig into the history in the way that we have been doing here in these last few lectures. So we are, in lots of ways, the heirs of this great scholar. Another important intellectual precursor for the kind of study that we've been doing was a great 19th century French scholar of Buddhism by the name of Eugène Burnouf. He wrote L'Introduction à l'Histoire du Bouddhisme indien, published in Paris in 1844. And I am happy to say, because I love relics, that I have taken an original copy of this out of Widener Library and held it in my hand. This great artifact, this great milestone in the study of Buddhism in the West. Burnouf's book made Mahayana Buddhism available to people like Henry David Thoreau and Ralph Waldo Emerson, the great transcendentalist authors and philosophers in Concord, Massachusetts. And through them, also independently, he made it available to many people who were interested in the study of Asia throughout the 19th century. And out of Burnouf's example came a remarkable tradition of European scholarship, especially French and Belgian scholarship about Buddhism in the late 19th century and in the early 20th century. So a lot of what we're able to say, quite frankly, about the early history of Buddhism came from these great European scholars, from Jones originally, the British colonial official in India, and Burnouf, who helped open up the textual tradition of Mahayana Buddhism to us and introduce us to texts like the Lotus Sutra and Nagarjuna and all of those other key historical artifacts that have been important in our understanding of Buddhism in this course. Another important European and American contact with the Buddhist world took place at the end of the 19th century. And this is one that helped Europeans and Americans get to know the Buddhist tradition in a certain way, but also rather remarkably shaped the development of Buddhism for good or ill in the 20th century. In 1880, the end of the 19th century, a woman by the name of Madame Blavatsky and one of her sidekicks, a man named Colonel Henry Steele Olcott, who were the founders of the American Theosophical Society, traveled to Ceylon and they converted to Buddhism. They accepted the teaching of the Buddha, they took the three refuges and converted to Buddhism, and then promptly began to interpret Buddhism for a Western audience, and not incidentally also to interpret Buddhism for the people in Ceylon. Now, if you can imagine yourself in the situation that they encountered in Ceylon in those days, traditional Sri Lankan Buddhism, or Sinhalese Buddhism, was very much on the defensive. British colonial influence was quite strong. There wasn't a tremendous amount of respect for an ancient tradition like the practice of Buddhism in Ceylon. And it was a bit unclear, frankly, how Buddhist teaching was going to be organized and presented in a way that would allow it to answer some of the criticisms that were coming from these colonial officers. Christian missionaries were in Ceylon, and they found a lot about the Buddhist tradition that they were concerned about, and that became the focus of their criticism, and it wasn't clear to Buddhist officials in Ceylon exactly how they would respond. Olcott and Blavatsky, particularly Olcott, gave an idiom and gave a style for the presentation of Buddhism that not only responded to these criticisms, but also made it possible for Buddhism to be taught in an aggressive and positive way to a Western audience. So Olcott, bless his heart, remarkable figure that he was, organized thinking about the Buddhist tradition in the 19th century in a way that allowed Buddhism to reach out to the rest of the world. How did he do this? Well, he published a document that was called a Buddhist catechism. Sounds a little funny now. You wouldn't use those words, really, to present Buddhism in the 20th or 21st centuries, but to Olcott, it sounded like a pretty good way to go about laying out the basic teachings of the Buddhist tradition. And in that Buddhist catechism, he put a particular spin on the Buddhist tradition that lingers today in many presentations of Buddhist view of the world. First of all, he criticized what he called superstitious rituals and devil dancing. All of these ancient Buddhist rituals in Ceylon that had to do with the worship of the gods, especially at remote shrines in the island where people went to confront the power of the local deities and to invoke their aid to deal with some of the complex issues of ordinary life, like bringing in a fruitful harvest or fending off the power of a ghost that seemed to be haunting the villages. Olcott said that none of this was real Buddhism.